Okay, I think that we should start. I think that we can start now. I guess so, right? Yeah, okay. Well, let's start. So, good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us today in this virtual panel on fiscal decentralization in Colombia, challenges and comparative perspectives. My name is Federico Corredor. I'm a PhD in economics from Georgia State University, and I'm currently a visiting scholar in the public finance research cluster of the university. I am also a proud Fulbright scholar, and this event is part of my knowledge transfer commitment to help foster stronger academic and policy dialogue between Colombia and the United States. This panel is possible thanks to the generous support of two main institutions. The first one is the Observatorio Fiscal and the Department of Economics at Pontificia Universidad Javeriana. The Observatorio is one of the most respected academic centers guiding fiscal policy debates in Colombia, known for its rigorous analysis, accessible publications, and active engagement with the public and media. The Observatorio plays a critical role in informing both policy discussions and public opinion in the country. So nowadays, whatever the Observatorio says about the fiscal policy is taken into account by politicians, by academics, and people in general in Colombia. The second institution that supports this panel is the Public Finance Research Cluster at Georgia State University, particularly through its International Center for Public Policy, a globally recognized institution with decades of experience supporting tax and fiscal reforms around the world. Founded under the leadership of Professor Jorge Martinez, the center has advised governments in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and most recently, the center is advising the governments of Mozambique and Cameroon in their decentralization process. I am extremely grateful for the collaboration and institutional support that made today's events possible. So before introducing of our distinguished speakers today, I would like to frame the topic for us and for the people who connect to know why the expertise of each of our speakers is so important. So why fiscal decentralization and why now? Fiscal decentralization, broadly speaking, is how taxing and spending responsibilities are distributed across different levels of government: national government, regional government, and local governments. The ultimate goal is to improve people's well-being by delivering public services: health, education, clean water, sanitation, and infrastructure. However, that provision has to be in a way that is efficient, responsive, and financially sustainable for the local governments, for the central government, and also that we don't want to create a system that burden too much households' disposable income. And that's the challenge of designing a good decentralization system. There is a theoretical promise here, isn't it? It's like local governments are closer to the citizens' needs and preferences, and therefore better positioned to deliver services. They know, like, let's say, the governors and the mayors in Colombia, they know firsthand what are the needs of their people, so they should be the ones delivering their services. But the problem is, like, that promise is often constrained by reality, in the sense that maybe there is limited administrative capacity, weak institutions, and uncertain revenue streams. In Colombia, currently, we are at a critical juncture. Regional and local leaders are calling for greater fiscal autonomy and more resources, while most of the economists and policymakers warn about the risk of transferring resources without a clear designation of responsibilities, adequate safeguards, and administrative capacity. So this is the tension and is the key debate today in fiscal decentralization in Colombia. The central government does not want to increase its deficit. In the case of local governments, do not comply with their responsibilities even after the increase in transfer. This has been seen a little bit as a fiscal recentralization trend. So just between 2003 and 2023, the share of national revenues transferred to subnational governments from the national government dropped from 40% to 20%. It means that in relative terms, the local governments have been receiving a smaller share of what the central government is receiving. So on that reality, there are legislative developments in Colombia that try to increase to 40% again the transfers, and also there are other initiatives that try to make participation of the regional governments out of the income tax and wealth tax. So more or less, that's the panorama that we have in Colombia. And with that in mind, let me introduce our speakers. We are fortunate to be joined by two leading experts from both sides of this conversation, each representing one of the institutions supporting this event. Professor Mauricio Salazar. Mauricio is a professor of economics at Pontificia Universidad Javeriana, and he is the director of the Observatorio Fiscal. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and he has served as a consultant for the World Bank, the Inter-American Bank, in areas of labor and public economics. Today, he will walk us through the current decentralization debate in Colombia from the perspective of Observatorio's research and policy engagement. The second speaker is Professor Charles Hankle. Charles is a professor of political science at Georgia State University, and he is the director of the International Center for Public Policy. His research focuses on comparative political economy, with particular emphasis on fiscal decentralization, budgeting, governance institutions. He holds a PhD in political science from Emory University. This last part is very important because one thing is the technical attributes of a fiscal decentralization reform: the shares, the formulas, the particular responsibilities. But the other part that is equally important is the political economy of the thing: the interest groups, the participation of politicians, the voting behavior. And Charles is an expert in the topic, and he will bring those lessons to talk a little bit about expenditure responsibilities, that is related to the law of responsibilities that is debated in Colombia, and also the political economy dimensions of a decentralization reform. So with this introduction, so let's begin. I'll hand it over to Professor Mauricio. And Mauricio, the floor is yours.
So thank you so much for this space, Federico and Charles. I mean, an honor to share this space with Charles, and like an expert in these topics, like broadly speaking in the world. Let me start by saying, I mean, your first claim is totally right. I mean, the discussion is how a given state is delivering goods and services to citizens, and also in this relationship, we know that there is a tax dimension. And I think that you want to do everything as simple as possible to the citizen, even in the tax part, but also in the expenditure on how people receive goods and services. Say, I just was delivering a course last week in Turkey, that you know that before it was the Ottoman Empire, and before it was Constantinople, and before and before and before. And when you look at the story of those empires, essentially the centralization was always there. Like the empires, typically they said, okay, there is this province, you do whatever, you have whatever god you believe in, but pay me some taxes so I fund the military and say some expenses from the central government. And that discussion is always been there. I mean, the Roman Empire has this idea of now we are too big, let's split in two because like fiscal governance over a huge territory it's is not so stable. And then, like, if you go to our independence stories, say in the end of the day, in the US and in Colombia, everything started by a tax disputes, right? Like the tea stuff in Boston, like, was the first candle to ignite all the independence of the nations. And for us, there was also some tax disputes about, and also tax dispute in production that we cannot do some things that Spain only can do. So all these debates are always been there in the story. Let me just start by saying, Federico, as you said, like, yes, in the Constitution of Colombia, there is like a big attempt of decentralization. However, since 2003, there was actually a fiscal crisis at the municipal and state level that actually like somehow still gave us the idea that the responsible adult is the central government, and then we started this process to reduce the transfers from the central government to the municipalities and states in Colombia. So there is always this tension on saying, okay, the central government is more responsible, so this is why it has more taxes. Say, for example, I mean, as you know, and we will speak about this, in the US, for example, VAT taxes are a decision at the state level. In Colombia, it's not. It's a decision at the national level. How do we tax land in Colombia is a municipal decision. Whether in our country is our story. So all these lines or which taxes is an state of municipalities managing and which services also are delivering to citizens, it's been always there. And I mean, from my point of view nowadays, the debate is not, I mean, we don't have like a real answer, and it depends country to country and depends on history and depends on many things. So on this context, let me just present some few slides about Colombia, like how are the yeah, how are things. So can you see my screen now?
Not yet. Yeah, now you're present.
Okay, there you go. So there is some Spanglish. I was rushing, so sorry for that. I will
Or
translate for Charles and for the audience. The lemma that we have in the Fiscal Observatory is public finance with everyone's reach. So there are some things that we do and to explain. We have some citizens guides explaining budget and the budget process and so on. And let me just start by saying that Colombia is a country of disparities. We are among the most non-equal countries in the most non-equal region of the world. And this also goes regarding geography and opportunities and so on. I just brought some statistics that we produced before. This is about the labor market in 2022. And say, for example, when you say hombre, it's male, and mujer is woman. So we split it, the information geographically between the five big cities, 19 middle cities, other urban areas, and rural areas. And essentially, what you are having here is on which firms are these workings are the workers working at 2022. So the categories that you have is firms between 1 and 5 workers, that is the blue. Then you have a red that is between 6 and 50. Then you have a green between 51 workers or employees and 200, and yellow is more than 200. And essentially, you see in this graph that the more rural you become, then these big firms essentially disappear. And in rural areas, the higher employer, the higher firms are small firms, and you see that there is like a huge disparity on this regarding Colombia. So talking also about in 2022, this is just to say, yeah, between male and females, you see that the average wages that the workers can do varies a lot between the firm sizes that are in the economy. That now we know also firm sizes correlate with geography. So there is this stuff that people in Colombia is earning and are receiving really different goods and services from the government. And you know, wages is one of the indicators on how the society is performing, and we do have this level of disparities. And on top of that, in 2022, we presented. Let me hide this. There is like several departments in Colombia, like all the departments. On the y-axis, you have the average wages over the minimum wage. So, for example, this is telling you that the ranges is that the average wage goes between 50% of the minimum wage to 2.5 the minimum wage. So, in this regard, you have Bogota in 2022 reaching that the earnings were about 2.5 in average relative to the minimum wage. But you go to other areas as like Guajira, Sucre, Cordoba that are below the minimum wage, and actually in Guajira, like the average worker earns half the minimum wage. So this is the level of disparities that we have in the country. And on the x-axis, we have the percentage of formality, and we do have like an increasing trend. Of course, this is not causality. And this is just to say, okay, Colombia is really unequal regarding the geography. And then all these rules that we do on sending money to more disadvantageous states and so on, and municipalities that is in the Colombian law, has this idea of eventually bring more convergence regarding the regions. So this is just to put like a floor on the discussion. So let me give you some departmental and municipal fiscal characteristics that we have in Colombia. And sorry that this was in Spanish, and I will tell you what this is saying. So essentially, municipalities and states and departments, how we call it in Colombia, they have three sources of revenue. First, they have own resources. Those are the taxes that they are able to manage. Then there are like the resources that the central government sends to municipalities and to states. This is what is called SGP, Sistema General de Participaciones. That is like from the chunk of money from the fiscal revenue that the central government is sending. This is the percentage that Federico was saying that goes to municipalities and states. So this is the second source. And there is capital resources that in Colombia, due to regulation, due to this crisis of 2003, then like states and municipalities in Colombia aren't allowed to go into a lot of debt or stuff like that. So this is the three type of resources, as in many other countries. And also we have the royalties, that is regalias. Royalties are not part of the budget, are extra budget money that enters. And I will just tell you, like in the end, how this money goes into the municipalities. That is a money that typically you look at like separately, but of course matters for the delivery of goods and services. So talking about the own resources, and here we have, and this is for 2022. On the left, you have the state level, and on the right, the municipal level. And then we are having here like the share of resources that they are receiving. So for the state level, you have this big blue that is called vicios in Spanish, like this is alcohol, tobacco, and all of that. And this is saying us that from the own resources, state level revenue depends a lot on this type of on taxing these goods. At the municipal level, say for example, what is interesting, you have this big blue that is ICA. This is a tax that is made on commercial activities, and this matters a lot. And also you have in Spanish predial that essentially is taxing the land. So this is how municipalities are getting like the biggest amount of money. So regarding this splitting that we have, this is how, regarding own resources, states and municipalities in Colombia are receiving the money. So talking about the Sistema General de Participaciones, SGP, this is the evolution in time. And one of the big debates that we have in Colombia is that the money that the government is sending to municipalities and to states in Colombia, they have a specific uses, and essentially like the municipal parts or the subnational level parts that are receiving the money, they cannot allocate the money however they want and however they think is better for their territory, but it is imposed from the central level. How do you use that money? There are some reforms in time that have changed the shares, but as you can see, the main usages of the money that is sent through SGP is education, that is the blue that is on the bottom, and in the orange you have health. So health is alluding in Spanish. There is also some agua, it's water. Water and sanitation also has like an important share. Uh, General purpose, the sky blue, the baby blue. It's also like in some spaces is uh, do whatever you do with the money. There are some restrictions, but colloquially is that, and other are other usages. And this is essentially how the money is being inflowing to the subnational level in Colombia. This is just to go okay within health and within education. Health, we have it in the left, and education in the right. And this is how the money it's been allocated. I don't want to enter into the details on what is inside, just to continue the conversation. And in a way, like the reform that we just, well, that was approved in the Colombian Congress 1 year ago, was to essentially go back to this idea of receiving more transfers from the central government. What was super interesting in Colombia is that first we fixed the percentage, like the money that was going from the central level to the municipals and states, and then we are discussing about which goods and services are going to be provided. So in a way, something that we think is that we started the discussion in an inverted way, because first you need to discuss what are the goods and services that our fair theorem, the part of the government that is closer to citizens, as it knows them better. So we want to identify what are they better on providing goods and services, and then maybe we can send the money from the central level to a municipal level. Something, let me go back to this discussion for a moment. Something that is being discussed a lot in Colombia, and there are some papers about it, and it's called tax laziness. That in a way, the higher money that is going from the central government creates tax laziness in municipalities and departments. Essentially, actually, the elasticity that some people have estimated is equal to one. If you send 1 peso to a municipality, then they reduce the effort to create own resources in 1 peso. So this is a study from the central bank. And one of the things that is being debated a lot is the need for a subnational level tax reform. Because, for example, this predial taxing the land is the first point in the peace process, and is something that we are really lacked on updating this taxing. So also this part of the discussion should be present in Colombia. And just to finish, as I was telling you, there is this extra budget money that enters throughout Colombia. That is the royalties. Royalties is from oil, from coal in Colombia, emeralds sometimes, and so on. In the past, only the municipality receiving the no taking out the resource was the one receiving the royalties. There was a reform saying we need to split this money throughout the country, and the money of royalties only can be used for investment decision. So there is a complicated algorithm and so on. We are, in a way, nowadays able to produce, for example, this type of maps regarding, the dispersion on income per capita that is going to Colombia. We are like kind of finishing this type of maps for own resources, for SGP and so on, to actually understand a bit more the heterogeneity that we have in Colombia, and to help this discussion on how to do better the decentralization. That, as we mentioned in the beginning, the big goal is to reach the citizens in a simpler and easier way. And with that, I finish my presentation. And Charles, enlighten us with your knowledge and what you know.
Oh, Federico, or should I go ahead and start?
Yeah. Charles, go
Okay.
ahead. Go
All
ahead.
right. Yes. Well, thank you so much, Mauricio. It's a real honor to be here, and I want to thank you, and I want to thank Federico for including me. The Fiscal Observatory, I know, is one of the central institutions that deals with these questions in Colombia and in South America more broadly. And so I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. And I hope that we can build a little bit further our connections, the connections between Georgia State and the university and the Fiscal Observatory. So let me apologize first by saying I'm sorry that I'm limiting the language here. I wish that I had the ability to do this in Spanish, and so please forgive me for that. I also just want to drop a caveat, which is that I haven't worked in Colombia, and actually most of my experience is in Africa and South Asia. We're currently, as Federico mentioned, we're currently working with the World Bank in Mozambique and in Cameroon, kind of rethinking public finance and decentralization in those countries. And so that's really been kind of absorbing me recently. And we've also done work in Nepal and India and other places. So I realize and am a big believer that the context is critical, and that it's important not to try to think that one size fits all for these reforms, and that's one reason I'm really glad Mauricio was able to go first, so that I can learn a little bit more about the context in Colombia. I've been reading about it, but I'm in no sense an expert. So take what I say with a grain of salt, and we can discuss a little bit later. So one thing that I think is notable in Colombia, at least based on my experience in other parts of the world, is that it started with subnational democracy in 1991 with the elections at the departmental and municipal levels. And I think that's fairly unusual for decentralization processes. In many parts of the world, you start with deconcentrated government. Where you have the tier, but it's essentially a deconcentrated part of the central government with appointed leaders. And then later on, that is transformed into a more democratic entity, often slowly, as resources get kind of decentralized. And it seems that this is an issue that has been dealt with back in the 90s in Colombia, and that there is well-established local democracy, which I think is absolutely critical for kind of puts Colombia ahead of the game, because we know that effective decentralization requires adequate resources, expenditure and revenue resources and transfers, in order to make decentralization work, because local governments need to have resources in order to provide services. But at the same time, the incentives need to be aligned with the resources in order for subnational governments to work their magic, to be closer to the people, as Federico mentioned, to be more informed, to be accountable. They need to be elected. And so that's step number one. So it seems like, reading about the Colombian case, there's been an interesting seesawing between adequate resources and expenditure responsibilities that goes back to the early 90s. And so, and please correct me if I'm mistaken about it, but it seems that in the early 90s, decentralization, there were a fair number of resources decentralized, but it wasn't really clear what the functions were going to be for the tiers of government. And there were very few fiscal rules. And so as a result, you had this incentive on the part of local governments to spend fairly widely, to borrow, to rack up debt, and also very little incentive to collect own source revenue because they were receiving funding from the central government in transfers and also by borrowing. And so the incentive structure for local collection, this fiscal laziness, I believe, as Mauricio referred to it, became a problem. And then because of that, in the 2000s, there was this tightening of transfers that dropped their percentage of GDP quite significantly. Even if the total amounts were not reduced, they grew much more slowly than GDP. And this kind of helped to deal with some of the overspending, some of the macroeconomic problems that can result from that. Fiscal rules were tightened, debt was reduced. This was obviously a critical way of correcting for previous profligate spending. But the problem, of course, is that when you're reducing the resources, it means that there is less fiscal autonomy and fiscal space for the subnational governments to provide services. And so you get this kind of seesawing between too many resources, not enough rules, and not really clear what the functions are, to tightening up, but now the subnational governments are not adequately autonomous. So now, this is at least my read on it, and we can talk later whether I'm getting it right. But it sounds like in the current situation, there's an effort to kind of balance that seesawing where with the 2024 legislation, the central government is talking about increasing the transfer system again and clarifying the expenditures so that we can have a balance between the resources that subnational governments have and their expenditure responsibilities. I think this is also something quite unusual, at least in my experience in other parts of the world. Usually what occurs, so that in fiscal decentralization, maybe the most fundamental, rule that you hear is that finance should follow function. So the idea that particular functions, whether it's primary education or health or whatever it might be, roads, that those are typically assigned first. Then you figure out what is the cost of providing those goods, and then you figure out how to finance it. So the key idea here is that you shouldn't have more functions than you can finance because you can't pay for them. But also you shouldn't have more finance than functions because that encourages profligate spending. The former problem is much more common internationally than the latter. And it seems like this is, like I said, an unusual element of Colombia because in Colombia, if I understand correctly, there was a period when the transfer system was too large for the functions that were decentralized, or at the very least, the functions were not clearly allocated. In most countries, it's very much the opposite, where the central government offloads all of these functions to subnational governments, but doesn't give them the resources to pay for them, which then allows the central government to kind of blame subnational governments if the functions aren't provided. It's a lot easier for central governments to reassign functions than it is to give money. And so I think this is an interesting distinction in the Colombian case. But whatever the case, the key challenge is to balance the functions with the finance. How are we ensured that for the functions that have been decentralized in education, health, public works, and whatever the case may be, that there is enough money to finance those things, but not more money than is necessary to finance those things, and to ensure also that the country doesn't get into macroeconomic trouble through debt accumulation and so forth. How do we balance the finance and the function? So I think the usual kind of international approach to doing that would be to start, as I said, by figuring out exactly what functions are to be decentralized. And I know this has been a debate over several decades. It's not that Colombia is new to this debate, but typically the advice given to countries is to first start with the functions that need to be decentralized by figuring out, okay, what particular sectors or policy areas are most appropriate for municipalities and departments to exercise. And then within those policy areas, what particular sub-functions might be split out. So for example, it might be appropriate for municipalities to take care of primary education and for departments to take care of secondary education and for the central government to do tertiary education, universities. But another very common approach is that these are all split up within. So it might be that the municipality provides the school buildings and pays for auxiliary services, like cleaning and repair and things like that. It might be that the central government educates and trains teachers and certifies them and then allows them to, basically identifies who is qualified to be a teacher. And then maybe the municipal government can decide which of that pool they want to hire and how much they want to pay them. Or maybe the pay is standardized centrally. There's different ways of doing it. But the key idea is that is this idea of subsidiarity, which is that the lowest tier of government that can efficiently and effectively do the thing, provide the service or whatever it may be, should be entrusted with it. And that has to do with all kinds of things like what the spillover effects are of providing the service. So, is the municipal government if the municipal government builds a university, then people from other municipalities might come to the university and benefit from it, whereas the people in those municipalities aren't financing the university. So normally you don't want a university at the local level. These are the kinds of things that are considered in the decentralization of functions. But usually that's the first start. The first step is to figure that out. And it sounds like maybe in Colombia, it might be good to kind of go back and think, okay, what exactly do we want each tier to do? Then you get to the costing issue. How much does it cost to provide primary education, to provide buildings, and so forth? And there are different ways of computing that. What we're doing, for example, in Mozambique, which is a very different country and much lower income than Colombia, but what we've been doing is going into the central budget and saying, okay, here is the function that could be decentralized. How much is the Ministry of Education currently paying for that function? And then you add that into the cost of that function that the central government is paying. You add that into the expenditure needs of the subnational government, because if we're transferring the function, now it's the subnational government that has to pay for it. And you know how much they have to pay, or one estimate of it is by looking at how much the center is currently paying. So you do all that costing. And then once you figure out exactly what the expenditure needs are at each tier, then you look at the revenue side. And on the revenue side, as Mauricio pointed out, you have own source revenue that subnational governments can collect themselves. And then you have the transfer system. Usually, the idea is that own source revenue is better than transfers, other things equal, because there's been a lot of research on this, but there's reason to believe that when people pay taxes locally, they can better connect what they're paying to the services that are rendered. And so that increases accountability. So if you're paying central taxes, but then the municipality is providing primary education, it kind of breaks the link between what you're paying and what the service provided is. But if you're paying the municipality and then receiving the service, there's a clearer link, and that tends to increase accountability. And it makes clear the fiscal trade-offs. Are we willing to pay for this service? How much are we willing to pay? That's called the benefit principle sometimes in fiscal finance. And so usually increasing own source revenue is kind of recommended, but it must be said that in the large majority of countries in the world, own source revenue is pretty weak, because there are a variety of reasons. Central governments sometimes don't want to give up the more buoyant sources of revenue. Mauricio mentioned the value-added tax, for example. And so they might be reluctant to decentralize these revenue sources. Sometimes when the central government and the subnational government compete over the same base, let's say they both have an income tax, then that can complicate collection, things like that. And so it can be, it can be difficult to get own source revenue out there. And in many countries, there's very little. Oftentimes it's fees, like parking fees and, fees for licensing cars and markets and things like that. But the more own source revenue, the better. But the main thing to think about, one own source revenue that's commonly used is a property tax, because with the value-added tax, it can be quite complicated to decentralize, because as you know, with the value-added tax, you're subtracting out the value added at each step of the production process, and that can cross subnational boundaries. And so it starts becoming complicated to decentralize that tax. But with the property tax, usually the property is kind of fixed in the area. And so that's kind of a classic one. So once you know what the own source revenue is and the cost, then you move to the transfer system. And, basically that the difference between the cost and the own source revenue is the fiscal gap. And that needs to be filled in by the transfers. And what's tricky here is, number one, it's easy to create perverse incentives. So if this is that kind of fiscal laziness that Mauricio mentioned. So the problem is that if you just look at how much is being collected and fill in that gap, then you are incentivizing subnational governments not to collect, right? Because they know that whatever they don't collect will be paid for by the central government. So you can't do that. Instead, one way to do it is to kind of aggregate all of the fiscal gap across the whole tier, either department or municipal, and say, okay, this is the total fiscal gap. This is the total difference between own source revenue and expenditure needs. And then you distribute that based on, sometimes using regression, based on a particular formula like poverty level, population, area, things like that. And so that allows you to not base the distribution, the transfer system, on how much is actually being collected, so that local governments, if they collect more, they have more to spend. And that's kind of the incentive structure you've got to create. My understanding is in Colombia, one challenge of the transfer system is that it is quite conditional. So I believe I was reading that the system requires at the department level 60% to be spent on education and maybe 20 or 30% on healthcare, things like that. And so very specific kind of rules that require subnational governments to spend in particular areas. And there's kind of some divided views on the wisdom of that. Some would say, well, we can't trust the subnational governments to spend on what's necessary. And so we need to make sure that they're not wasting the money and that they're really spending on education, because that's the national priority. But the problem is the more conditions you set, the less autonomy the subnational government has and the less reason there is to decentralize, right? I mean, if the central government is going to tell the subnational governments what to spend on, why even bother having elected subnational governments? And so I would say most countries have all kinds of variation in terms of the autonomy they give. But most countries kind of split the difference. They have some rules about how minimums that need to be spent, but they also allow a fair bit of autonomy to make choices. One way to do that is by having what we call block grants, where you say it has to be spent, this amount has to be spent on education, but whether you spend it on teachers or school buildings or materials or whatever is up to you. So all of these are kind of options. Another one that's kind of hot in the fiscal federalism area would be performance-based grants. So basically, instead of ex ante telling subnational governments what they need to spend, 60% on education or whatever, you let them spend however they want, and then you do an ex post evaluation, looking at actual outcomes like literacy rates, enrollment rates in school, infant mortality rates for health, or whatever it might be. And then you reward or punish the subnational governments based on whether they're actually producing the outcomes you want. And you can do this by withholding funding or whatever, or giving extra funding. These are really hot right now. The World Bank is pushing them a lot. In Mozambique, they've kind of developed a system that they want to be used there, and in Cameroon too. The tricky thing about this is that it requires a lot of state capacity, especially related to data collection, because you have to be able to measure, you have to set the outcomes in advance that you want to measure. Like the literacy rate should increase by 5% or something like that. And then you actually have to have the data capability to measure those changes in each subnational entity. I know Colombia has more than 1,000 municipalities. So this is not a small thing to be able to collect data at the municipal level in order to, of good enough quality so that everybody says, okay, we understand why this municipality was punished for not providing the outcomes and this one wasn't. And so there are those issues. Matching grants are also possible to say, okay, we'll give you more money. The amount of money that you spend, we will match as a central government in order to encourage you to spend more on education. So rather than saying you've got to spend this on education, you say, well, the more you spend on education, the more transfers you'll get as an incentive structure that leaves some autonomy, but also encourages more expenditure in that area. Typically, for the transfer system, you want to have one instrument per function. So one instrument to encourage education spending, one instrument to encourage equalization, and so forth. Looking at all of the inequality data that Mauricio provided, I think one thing that's really critical in Colombia's case is a strong equalization grant. What an equalization grant will do is basically provide higher levels of transfers to places that are less able to collect their own source revenue. So Bogota probably can pay for itself. Other places can collect almost nothing. So an equalization transfer will usually centralize funding from places like Bogota, and then using a formula, redistribute those funds out to other places that can't do it. Sometimes this is even more direct. I worked a few years ago in Vietnam with the UN Development Program, and there, basically, Ho Chi Minh City finances virtually all other municipalities in the country because it's so much richer. And so they're a huge part of their collections go into a central pot and are redistributed, which is sometimes called a Robin Hood system, steal from the rich and give to the poor type thing. So that's another option. Or you can have a revenue sharing system where, the money is instead of directly going from, say, Bogota to a lower income part of the country, it's collected by the center and then redistributed according to a formula. But one thing you want to make sure, along with equalization, that you do is you don't disincentivize the richer places to collect their own revenue, because if you're too redistributive, then a place like Bogota will not be able to attract, investment and so forth. It's the economic driver of the country. You don't want to impoverish your economic driver. So you also have to redistribute, but not to the point where you end the incentives for collection and reduce the quality of public services in the richer places. And so, yeah. So one thing that I read about that I understand about the Colombian case is that let's see, that the various laws have kind of tied the total transfer system to total revenue collection. I believe that it was 39%, and then it went down to 20%, and then they're talking about bringing it back up. 39% is a really big amount internationally, and I think that's a really great sign of the commitment to decentralization. In Cameroon, where we're working, it's 15%, and they haven't met it. In Mozambique, it's even lower, and so I think that shows a strong kind of commitment to decentralization. And generally speaking, tying the total transfer system to total revenues is a good idea, because it means that the government can't play politics as much with the transfer system. They have to provide this amount of money. The tricky thing is that it makes the transfer system less flexible. So it's harder to reduce spending when it might be necessary, and it's harder to increase it when it might be necessary. But one thing that you can do is kind of have that, base that percentage, not arbitrarily, but based on a calculation of the fiscal gap. Then say, okay, the fiscal gap is X amount. What is the percentage of total revenues that matches that X amount? Fix it there, and then you can revisit it periodically. So one thing that might be useful to do is, and I don't know how this is done right now, and I'll be interested to know, but kind of have a transparent institution that oversees the transfer system. And there are various models for this. So India has a finance commission that meets every 5 years and is made up of experts. And they make a recommendation, which then Parliament usually implements, but doesn't have to. There are other countries that actually, South Africa is like this, where they have a representative body where you actually have representatives of subnational governments on the panel, along with representatives of the finance ministry. And so that's another model. Sometimes these bodies are within the Ministry of Finance, kind of in an advisory capacity. Sometimes they are independent bodies. But what they can do is every few years, they can revisit the finance system and make recommendations. Do we need to change the peg on central revenue? Do we need to change the formula? They can also be in charge of collecting data, and usually through the National Data Center that collects data, they make sure the relevant data are being collected, analyze the performance grants, produce papers around whether the transfer system is functioning, stuff like that. So on the political economy side, well, that's one kind of political economy element, but I wanted to mention just a couple other things. I read that there are, in addition to the departments and the municipalities, there are some subnational entities that are representative of indigenous populations. I wasn't able to find very much about that, so I'd be curious to know more, but this kind of what we call asymmetric decentralization is a common feature in diverse countries, where you might allow more autonomy to groups that might be less tied to the center in order to kind of buy them off, if you want to put it that way. And many countries have examples of this type of asymmetric structure. And so I'm just kind of curious how that functions in Colombia and whether it's been used. There's a lot of research that shows equalization grants help to tie countries together. So if, inequality is dangerous for the territorial integrity of a country, regional-based inequality in particular, where you have one place that's a lot poorer than the other. And so having equalization grants can be a way to try to tamp down any, secessionist feelings, or to strengthen the role of the state in those places. Um, the role of political parties, I think one thing that the research shows is that having elected subnational governments reduces the stakes of elections. This is something we're dealing with in Mozambique, where they had a civil war for a long time, and one of the ways to kind of tamp down problems there is to allow subnational elections, because the losing party, if they lose at the center, can win at the subnational level and be more satisfied. So it's not a winner take all situation. And that seems to be something that Colombia has already implemented. It also makes the political parties cooperate in governing the country. But one challenge is that there's a lot of research in many places around the world. I did a study like this of India that kind of shows that when the party in power in the center and in the state are aligned, states are more likely to get resources. And so the central government can kind of play partisan politics by giving more resources to states that support them, or to swing states. That happens in the US, as we all know. And so that is an argument for having clearer transparency and standards. If you have if the transfer system is governed by clear formula, it's harder for the central government to play politics with their favored subnational entities. And then one final point on the distribution of natural resources. A huge question in countries that are natural resource rich. It's something we've been thinking about in Mozambique, where they've just discovered a ton of natural gas in the north, and that has sparked an insurgency. So they're very, very sensitive to the issue. And there, the subnational entities where resources are found have the right to, I think it's 15% of natural resource revenues. It's like, I'm trying to remember the numbers, but that's split between provinces, districts, and municipalities. And then 85% goes to the sovereign wealth fund of the country. Some people might say that's not enough to the subnational governments. I mean, the question is is natural resource extraction causing problems for subnational governments? Is it creating environmental degradation? Are local people being employed in the natural resource sector, or things being brought in? This was the issue in Mozambique, where Total, the French company Total, and the American company Exxon basically came in with all their own people and engineers and everything else, extracted the resources, and people felt like they're just getting exploited. So you definitely want to have a system where the local places where resources are extracted benefit. And I think I heard Mauricio say that all of the resource money was being kept locally. Maybe I misunderstood, but
At the
that
be- at the beginning, and then they switch to split about the resources throughout the country.
okay. Yeah, because that would be an unusual going really far in the other direction. A lot of times, then not natural resource rich places will get angry, and so some sort of a negotiated balance is usually what is necessary there. So I'll just stop there. I know I've talked for a
Yeah,
while.
thank you very much, Charles. I think that one of the main, what I would say, like early conclusion is that we can see that the topic is really complex. Like the design of a functional decentralization system has so many different things that has to be considered in order to like reach some sort of like equilibrium in which more or less like local governments are okay, the central government as well. And I would like just to, if Mauricio of course wants to ask some questions to Charles, or the opposite is fine. I just want to like just highlight a couple of things before like and ask you some questions. So for Mauricio, I think that you like highlighted very important things in terms of like there is not a unique answer. And you highlighted also the fact that the disparity discussion is essential in Colombia. One thing after listening to Charles, I feel a little bit optimistic about the capacity that Colombia have. Like we have several challenges, but after listening to Charles, I think that the centralization system in Colombia is a little bit more mature. It has gone through several different stages. And for example, like data collection is challenging, but Colombia is good at it to some extent. Like it's like so many of the different proposals that Charles has in mind that has been implemented in our place are not very like far from reachable. And I think that what happened in Colombia was like kind of this reform for going back to the 40% of the transfers was more like a politician's move. Like let's secure the results in the Congress and then we'll discuss the responsibilities of the functional distribution. Otherwise, we will get stuck in let's discuss what are the functions and things, and we will never get the resources. So I would like to ask you, Mauricio, if you think that these laws that has been passed, like the responsibility, like the increase in the shares in the transfers, and also eventually make departments to be part of the income tax or the wealth tax, according to like what you have been doing in the observatorio, these reforms could decrease the disparities or eventually could make it worse. Because one thing that is also on the pessimistic side is like we still have so much disparities. Like we have done so much, but still so many municipalities don't have access to clean water and sanitation. And then it's like kind of it's a little bit problematic in the sense to see that maybe we have done so many things, like very specific formulas, very specific things, going from lots of resources to less, but then it seems that the disparities are not getting reduced. So what do you think, Mauricio, about how these new legislative initiatives will eventually help the disparities discussion in Colombia?
I mean, first, I have to say that I don't know. I feel like really, and sorry for my lack on English in this expression, like a real pain on the process, because in the end, like it was a debate that eventually it was a huge reform, and eventually it had 5 debates, and it seems more like a politician's negotiation on I will give you more money to the representatives, and you can go to your state municipality and say I'm bringing more resources, but also you have to support the country level reforms. So it was more like a political negotiation than actually thinking about the best outcome. And I have to say, and as Charles said, like this idea of first thinking about the finance and then the functions, I think that this is, and of course, we are a country with civil conflict inside. It could be a recipe for like disasters later on. Also, say I want to mention that in the macroeconomic fiscal way, in the central government, we are in a humongous deficit. Like nowadays, we are reaching 7% of deficit to GDP. And also in debt to GDP, we are in 60, while like similar countries, Peru and Chile, are about 40 and so on. And for example, the deficit of Peru and Chile is 3.53. So in this regard, in a way, something that worries me a lot is that we are doing this reform on saying take the income of the central government, send to municipalities in the money that we have the highest fiscal deficit after the pandemic, and actually we can go higher to higher levels. So something that I've been asking to people is okay, we do have this humongous level of debt. And as you are going to send more money to regions, are the regions going to help to pay the national debt, or the money will have less income and the same level of debt and deficit? And then, like, if in the end the national level like goes into really bad financial situation, then all the country is going to be in a good shape. So I think that in this regard, I do think that we, depending on how we do the function, we could be facing actually a humongous macroeconomic shock, depending on how we do that. So I do think that there is a big risk in the way that we negotiate the functions, given that we already signed the financing part. So I don't know, something just while I was listening to Charles, of course, this debate is humongous, but I think I was many times in a few words, so we don't have also a lot of time, thinking about the principal agent problem, right? Like in all these incentives and who, I don't know, like we need to bring schooling in Catatumbo, that is a region in Colombia close to Venezuela. Is this the municipality? Is the state? Is the central government? So typically it happens that when things are good at any level, the president says, okay, we are doing things right. And then you take out incentives for the mayors to do, or the governors to do things in the right way. So yeah, I was thinking how complicated it is to actually maybe slice the delivery of goods and services. And when Charles gave this example of primary is municipal, I don't know, the secondary it's a state level, and then universities, tertiary it's national level. Then you create like someone that has to deliver, and then you have someone to point out. When like within a school someone is giving me the pencil, the other one the blackboard, and the other one the door, then it's super easy that you get nothing be done because everyone is going to say, okay, I don't have blackboard because there is no door, and then someone will steal the blackboard. So I don't know, like I was thinking that I don't know in equilibrium, in equilibrium, I would like something that either the municipalities are managing most of the taxes, and then you reach an equilibrium where people is sending directly money to the mayors, and then you have like in the income part like a direct responsibilities, or actually you can go the other way around and most of the taxes are at the national level, and you give a lot of resources to municipalities, pointing out you need to deliver these goals. Actually, what Charles said is something that I would like in Colombia, like instead of saying you need you have these shares to be spent in education and so on, we are having this humongous debate that given that yes we have indigenous communities, we have people that maybe have other development ideas than the ones that we are measuring, then we need more fiscal independence that people can do whatever they want. But of course, say in the constitution there is these indigenous communities and some Afro-descendant communities that they essentially say, okay, we are in this subset or in this part of the country. We are not going to be ruled by the typical budgetarian processes and so on. And then we do whatever we do with the money. So it is good in the independence level of those communities, but also say the advancements in goals it's been really slow and there is nothing that we can do about it. So I don't know, like I was just kind of also thinking that yes, if we are going in a point, I was kind of thinking that like given that the point one of the peace process is to the tax on properties to be updated, I do think that there are two games a given civil conflict in some of the places, right? One is okay, let me update the land, then I have more taxes, then I can show more things to the society that they will re-elect me or my party or something. Or the other one is, okay, I have some deals with paramilitary groups, with guerrilla and so on. Then as they are doing, growing coca and marijuana and stuff like that, then I won't update the cadastre in order to know exactly and to tax more the land because I already made a deal with them. So at the municipal level, how do you deal with the land? I think is super problematic. And I don't know, like I think that as I said, like the two equilibriums might work. Maybe the Colombian state says, okay, I'm going to be broken, then I need to take in charge of the property land and to update it, and then I can also pay for the fiscal deficit. And also we send more money to municipalities, and I said, these are your functions and do all the things that I wasn't doing. Or you give more resources to municipalities and eventually you decrease the share in the transfer part. But I don't know, like all of this idea of how do we do the system to have like that the principal agent is the same person and not other persons, I think that is super interesting for democracies. Also say nowadays, even that we have in the constitution this idea that we have to elect the mayors. That was a debate that the president of Colombia was saying, no, I am your boss, and you cannot go to the US and speak to other peoples, to other governments. So all these debates on how many power is centralized, revenue, expenditure, even political representation is still on. So that approach that Charles was saying, or for me, like the big headline is we need to really think carefully the incentives that we do with whatever map we do between the expenditure and the revenue. We need to be able that the citizens know exactly who is delivering the pencils in a school, who is delivering primary education. If we are able to slice the goods and services delivery at that level, then I think in equilibrium we should be expecting more fiscal efficiency because there is more citizens control, and actually people can know exactly who to point out when there are something that are not being delivered. And yeah, I will stop here just for matters of time.
Thank you very much, Mauricio. Like, don't forget if you want to like ask anything directly to Charles, I'm just going to point out like highlight some points of what Charles said, and in the meantime you can think about any question. As I said, Charles, like when I was listening to you, it's very interesting to see how we talk about fiscal decentralization is good, the relationship between citizens and local governments is good, but when it comes to the actual reform, is a very detailed and huge task. When you want, as Mauricio was saying, well, if you want to do this right, you need to have the data, like this amount of money that I'm going to give to you that before was like paid by the Minister of Finance or the education, now it's going to be paid by the local, like the municipality. All that data, this kind of, it seems that it's line by line if we want to to perform this. And of course, in this case, Charles' role here is like a very challenging one because this could be like a huge consultancy work, right? Okay, design the law of responsibilities for Colombia. And then it's like lots of proposals as the ones that Charles mentioned that are very interesting to think, like matching grants, equalization grants, and all those things is when you go to the detail and say, okay, what benefits Colombia? One thing that I was thinking is that Colombia do have this index of performance at department level and municipal level. They are, I mean, all these rules, like I feel that Colombia progress a lot in this. We have the data, but what we have been seeing is like the municipalities are not doing good kind of thing, like we measure them and they do not improve like systematically. It seems that there is some sort of a structural problem with some municipalities. And there is something that maybe, Charles, I wanted to ask you if you have a little bit more information. When you talk about spillover effects, one of the main discussions in Colombia, and also Mauricio talked about that because of the geographical disparity and the challenges that like a different geography proposes, that there are no many long-term projects that incorporate many regions or many municipalities. It's like each municipality is taking its own part of the share and doing one thing here and there, but there are no like big projects that could have spillovers for many municipalities. And that's something that has been challenging in the sense, and this is also, Colombia is a little bit sui generis in this thing, and it's like departments, by constitution, the departments should play that role of connecting and interacting regions. But departments are a very weak institution in terms of taxation because they don't have, the only source is tobacco and alcohol, and that's not much. They don't participate in land, wealth, or income, or like value add taxes. So they do not like fulfill that role of coordination, and then we do not have those spillover effects. It seems that we have money, see, like transfers, royalties here, there are maybe, but that gets like diluted, let's say, in small projects without regional and long term, like I don't know if you have some like outputs on that sense, Charles.
Wow, thank you so much, Federico and Mauricio. There's a lot to unpack there. I'll try to do it real fast. Um, One thing I wanted to mention, I had read about the concerns that increasing the transfer system will produce macroeconomic problems because of the level of debt, and Mauricio mentioned those as well. And I think that's obviously a huge issue to consider. I think one way to deal with that, and I think Mauricio was also kind of implying this when he talked about expenditure assignment. In theory, at least, decentralization can be revenue neutral. And the way that it's revenue neutral is basically by costing the services that are held at the center and then decentralizing both the service and the finances necessary to pay for the service. And so if you do that, then at least in theory, decentralization should not increase total expenditure. So except for maybe the costs of transferring it, the transaction costs, if you want to put it that way. But in general, it can, at least in theory, be revenue neutral. In practice, sometimes it isn't because the central government, doesn't want to transfer all of the money. And so maybe new resources need to be found and you have duplication. But to be careful, if you're careful about costing, it can at least happen in theory. The performance measures that Federico mentioned sound fantastic. These have been parts of transfer formulas in many places. I have a friend who does, he's an academic, but one of the things he does is run the analysis of the panchayats, the local governments in India, and those numbers, which he does every 5 years, I think, are then incorporated, oftentimes used in the transfer formulas. And so I think the fact that Colombia has that can be very useful for kind of rewarding well-functioning places. The spillover effects issue. Yeah, I mean, I think Federico mentioned probably what would be the most obvious way of dealing with that, which would be to strengthen the departments. In theory, the middle tier government ought to be the one, as he said already, coordinating the lower tiers. And they would need to have adequate resources to do that, which might mean transferring more revenue sources to them. But another thing that, when the spillover effects, when spillovers are larger than a municipality, but not as large as a department, another option is to have kind of groups of municipalities that coordinate with each other in order to provide a particular service. This is kind of caught on as a popular approach in a number of countries. France is one that comes to mind, where you have communes as their basic level there, and they have these intercommunal agreements on particular service delivery areas. So if there's spillover effects on like trash collection or the provision of water or something, then several communes will come together, sign an agreement, sometimes they create a new institution, like an intercommunal body that will help provide that. Even here in the U.S., where sometimes the counties and cities don't want to coordinate. Here in Atlanta, though, there is something called the Metro Atlanta Regional Commission, which basically puts the city of Atlanta and the counties and all the municipalities in the region meet and coordinate. So there are ways of kind of overcoming that with some coordination. The cadastre, yeah, I mean, this is such a challenge, especially in kind of less developed or lower income parts of the country, to be able to actually price property. I know there are ways, I'm not an expert on this, but I know there are ways that people use satellite imaging and various things in order to try to kind of get a fair estimate of costs. Some places, instead of using market value, if that's not something that can be computed, they might just have a fixed amount per square foot if it's a house, or I should say square meter, or square kilometer if it's land, and just say this is about right, and do it that way. But that is something that the data necessary in order to administer property tax can be pretty high, which is one reason why a lot of countries don't get a lot of money from that. They might be they might get more money actually from property tax on like vehicles, which are a little bit easier to track, like motor vehicles and things like that, because you can, make somebody pay in order to get a license and in order to get a license plate. I think that there is an accountability versus efficiency trade-off, which both of you all have talked about. So if you split the functions within, let's say, primary education, where the blackboard and the building is provided at one tier and the teachers are hired at another, and so on and so forth, then the accountability, and Mauricio said this well, I think it can be reduced because people don't know who is responsible for what. The more complicated, this is one of the challenges. Skeptics of decentralization, one of the things they point to, that the information challenges, the more you decentralize, the greater the information challenges are for voters who have trouble remembering exactly who's responsible for what. On the other hand, there is an efficiency, or there can be an efficiency advantage to breaking up sectors when you're assigning expenditures. So it might be that the central government has an advantage in teacher training because they have the expertise and the resources to set the curriculum for teachers. They have the ability to create universities, and you're not going to have a university to train teachers in every municipality. So, on the other hand, the local governments might have an advantage in providing the building because they know where people live and they know kind of how to construct a building and who the local contractors are. So there might be greater efficiency benefits by splitting things up that way, but it might lead to accountability issues. So I don't think there's any absolute answer to that trade-off. If on a broader issue, and I'm far from an expert on this, but I'd be curious to hear from you all your views on this. I know that there's obviously a history of civil conflict in Colombia, and some parts of the country, and maybe I think has improved, but some parts of the country the central government may have a weaker grasp on or weaker control over. And so I guess one question might be, how can decentralization improve that situation or not make it any worse? Is decentralizing going to weaken the grip of the central government over all of its units, or could it potentially strengthen it? And my guess is for Colombia, this political economy question, setting aside all the technical fiscal stuff, is a kind of a big deal. So I'll just leave with that and see what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I don't know, Mauricio, if you want to reply to that. I was about to say that, Mauricio, you bring the fact that many municipalities in Colombia, they face this problem to have to deal with illegal armies that work as the de facto authority. And then, of course, taxation is hard if you say, well, I have to pay taxes to the central government, but also to the illegal armies. So that's something that unfortunately we still have that problem. It's something that is there, and it's like an additional layer to the challenge that of course, for the sake of time, we couldn't go deep, but I think that Charles' question is genuine, in the sense that that's something that has to be considered. How the presence of illegal armies in certain regions and in certain municipalities could jeopardize any law of responsibilities, because at the end of the day, anyways, nor the municipalities or even the central government has control under that region. But I don't know, Mauricio, what you think about that.
No, I think that is the, I don't know, 10 trillion question for us. Like,
Yeah.
because say if there are more money for the municipalities, maybe actually you have more active battle for the legal groups to manage the municipality, because I can build the roads to take out my coca grows and my marijuana grows, or my gold illegal mining. So I don't know. I think that that can go to any direction. Also, if there are more money to municipalities, and I don't know, you have like a good mayor, then the guy will battle better the legal groups and will provide better education, so the teenagers has less incentives and actually has more municipal enforcement to don't allow them to enroll into guerrillas or paramilitary groups. But I think that in this regard, yeah, could go both ways. And yeah, I don't know. I think that given Colombia heterogeneity, you will have some ones that will go to one path and some others that will go the other way around. Uh, yeah, and say I also think that unfortunately in the last years we are having more presence of legal groups in different municipalities of Colombia that before they weren't, or for or for some period. So with more power of illegal groups, and you know that also there is this battle or this cooperation with Mexican cartels, with Venezuelan cartels that probably are also there. There are links throughout Ecuador, Peru. So I'm just to saying that the complexity of illegality and how do you move that to the local governance? I don't know. I don't know exactly where it could go.
Yeah, I completely agree. And in that regard, Charles, Mauricio, and me are like not the economists, but just Colombians who wonder about what could happen with that complexity issue, because that is not even about decentralization, like security. It's just a problem for the central government that is has not been fulfilled, and it's some sort of like a permanent conversation in Colombia. From time to time, we kind of get better, and then we go back to not that good. But having said that, I would like to do some closing remarks. Or I don't know if Mauricio or Charles have something additional to say before I close. I don't want to keep you here all morning. I know that you have like more things to do, and you already give like 1 hour and a half to this panel that has been amazing. So
So no, like from my point of view, I have enjoyed a lot of the conversation. I think that is really interesting. This idea on, yeah, we need that the different level of government, they have defined tasks, and as Charles said, we need to do that as easy to make the citizens to know exactly who to point out. If we go to this heterogeneity of blackboard, I don't know, municipal level and then pencils, another one, the citizens are not going to do anything because this is too detailed. So I don't know, like I take this idea that we need to do simpler who is delivering the goods and services. And also, of course, we need to do that in taxation. 1 year ago, I went to a meeting, and there was a company that you know. I showed you like in the municipal level, the SICA, that is also when you sell something, then you need to send that money, and the municipal level they do whatever they want with some thresholds and some limitations. So there is a company that says to you, I will give you a package on calculating the amount of taxes that you need to pay if you are selling in 3 municipalities, in 10, in 20, in 30. So is that big the heterogeneity that we have, that there is someone making money out of telling companies that are selling at different municipalities, I will tell you exactly how much money you have to pay. So I think that for Colombia, the big challenge is to go simple in whatever regard, that for citizens it's easier to do things and that you don't need to have these companies calculating for your taxes at the municipal, state, and the national level. I think that we need to, I don't know, invent that road for Colombia. Simple tax collection and simple relationship with the different government levels.
thanks, Mauricio. Charles, do you want to add some additional comments?
I just want to thank you for the opportunity to participate and to learn about Colombia. So thank you, Federico. Thank you, Mauricio. And I hope that we can continue the conversation.
Well, just to finish, I'm just want to express my gratitude with you both to participate in this conversation. I definitely think that after listening to Charles, I think that there are many ways in which Colombia can make these legislative initiatives work. As I say, like Charles mentioned at least four different ways in which we can like battle these tensions between accountability, efficiency, with a good mix of like fixed rules but autonomy at the same time. And I think that we can revisit this video just to have some idea of things that have been implemented in other countries, not because there is just one rule, but we can also learn from international experience and know that there are different ways to approach decentralization. Today's conversation, I think, that highlighted that this is a promising thing for Colombia, but this is also a very complex topic. And again, I just want to repeat that the panel is part of an ongoing effort of building bridges between academic communities in Colombia and the US. I would love to see later on, like the Public Finance Research Cluster and the Observatorio Fiscal, like engaging in collaborative projects, doing research, doing policy analysis. The very nature of both institutions is doing the same, informing the people and understanding the complexities of like the tax systems. So just for the prosperity of the people who are still connected, follow the Observatorio Fiscal in social media, follow the International Center for Public Policy and the PFRC. And once again, thank you for joining us and have a great day. Charles, Mauricio, everybody else, thank you very much and have a good day.